So, welcome to our continuation of the philosophy of rebirth. And tonight I think we close the chapter, the 20th, in part 2 of the Life Divine. Let's read the last sentence of the last paragraph that we covered last week. It tells us where we are. As a spirit, he is one with the transcendence which is immanent in the world and comprehensive of it. As a soul, he is at once one with and part of the universality of Satchit Ananda, self-expressed in the world. His self-expression must go through the stages of the cosmic expression. His soul experience follow the revolutions of the wheel of Brahman in the universe. This is the nature of what we are as an individual, that eternal above, unmoving part of the transcendent Satchit Ananda. Here in the world, following progressively the various stages, all the steps laid down in the cosmic order. And this implies a grand scheme in the unfolding of Brahman as a manifestation, that the cosmos is not without order, without purpose, but has a deep machinery which proceeds from step to step so as to provide steps which are upward moving on the ladder of conscious growth. These steps are the sheaths of matter, the powers of life, and the visions of mind and what lies beyond mind. All of this is meant to fashion a subtle and sophisticated vehicle in which the individual can reach the fullness of its experience in the cosmos, find all the riches that Brahman has invested in this universe, and yet come to know itself as a living, breathing, thinking expression of that timeless being which it always is, because it is that which has become immanent here. That transcendence saturates this world. We are literally drenched in divinity. So with that, let's proceed with the rest of this chapter. The universal spirit in things, involved in the nescience of the physical universe, evolves its nature self in a succession of physical forms up the graded series of matter, life, mind, and spirit. So the nescience, as he's mentioned before, is not an utter nescience. It is the unknowing state of nature which has fallen into a deep swoon, but is recoverable. The nature self, that's those aspects of ourselves moving and developing in time and space. Matter, life, mind, that's clear. Spirit here is suggestive of the supramental range of consciousness, which is the ordered expression of spirit above in what we call the transcendence, what is normally transcendent to our common experience in the universe we know. It emerges first, speaking here about the universal spirit, It emerges first as a secret soul in material forms, quite subject on the surface to the nescience. It develops as a soul still secret, but about to emerge in vital forms that stand on the borders between nescience and the partial light of consciousness, which is our ignorance. It develops still farther as the initially conscient soul in the animal mind, and finally as the more outwardly conscious but not yet fully conscient soul in man. The consciousness is there throughout in our occult parts of being. The development is in the manifesting nature. Remember, consciousness force, Chit Shakti, the very root, the very cause of the manifestation of this world, and indwells what it manifests. It may be hidden to patent view, but must always be present. This evolutionary development has a universal as well as an individual aspect. The universal develops the grades of its being and the ordered variation of the universality of itself in the series of its evolved forms of being. The individual soul follows the line of this cosmic series and manifests what is prepared in the universality of the Spirit. So it is the universal person, you might say, who lays down all the grades that we name as the steps upwards of the universe: matter, life, mind, above in the spirit. Also, the ranges of the supramental and beyond: Ananda, Chit, Tapas, Sat. All of this has been laid down in preparation. And the individual follows these steps. If you can imagine that this cosmic person has built this stairway from the top down, and this stairway leads into the gulfs of the darkness of what we call the nescience. But we find our first footing. We step out of it. We become alive. Organized matter starts to live. Living matter starts to think. And each one of those transitions is it's a gigantic transition. And every one of those transitions is intended for the individual to follow. It's been set by the universal. The individual must follow these lines out, reasserting the truths of the universe in terms of individuality as the progressive spear point of evolution as it moves forwards and upwards. The universal man, the cosmic Purusha in humanity, is developing in the human race the power that has grown into humanity from below it and shall yet grow to supermind and spirit and become the Godhead in man who is aware of his true and integral self and the divine universality of his nature. The individual must have followed this line of development. He must have presided over a soul experience in the lower forms of life before he took up the human evolution. So in other words, the soul predates its human figuration. As the one was capable of assuming in its universality these lower forms of the plant and animal, so must the individual now human, have been capable of assuming them in his previous stages of existence. So the individual has found ways of asserting itself in various iterations of being, whether they be physical, vital, or mental. He now appears as a human soul, the spirit accepting the inner and outer form of humanity. But he is not limited by this form any more than he was limited by the plant or animal forms previously assumed by him. He can pass on from it to a greater self-expression in a higher scale of nature. So the individual, the soul of the individual, pre-exists any of the forms which it inhabits, and so is not abruptly ended by the assumption of the human form, but may continue to aspire and grow and evolve beyond it. If nature has higher scales of existence available to exploration, the soul can go there. To suppose otherwise, he writes, would be to suppose that the spirit which now presides over the human soul experience was originally formed by a human mentality and the human body, exists by that, and cannot exist apart from it, cannot ever go below or above it. In fact, it would then be reasonable to suppose that it is not immortal, but has come into existence by the appearance of the human mind and body in the evolution, and would disappear by their disappearance. But body and mind are not the creators of the spirit. The spirit is the creator of the mind and body. It develops these principles out of its being. It is not developed into being out of them. It is not a compound of their elements or a resultant of their meeting. If it appears to evolve out of mind and body, that is because it gradually manifests itself in them, and not because it is created by them or exists by them. As it manifests, they are revealed as subordinate terms of its being, and are to be finally taken up out of their present imperfection and transformed into visible forms and instruments of the Spirit. So, it is the Spirit which is the creator of body and mind. And this says no more than what we've said before. Satchit Ananda, Chit Shakti, immerses itself in this world as a universal manifestation. It also is the cause of the manifestation of the individual, coming through massive self-multiplication at the level of the supramental. We are all seated as individuals above in that, and so exist here, pre-exist our existence here in any form, and manifest as an evolving spirit moving immortally through time. Our conception of the Spirit is of something which is not constituted by name and form, nama and rupa, but assumes various forms of body and mind according to the various manifestations of its soul being, implying that we may have existences stretching throughout all the time of the cosmos. And this is consonant with original Vedantic insight as recorded in the Upanishads, Gita, etc. There is only one being in varying, modulating manifestation. One common self constantly reforming and developing itself and manifesting greater and greater degrees and powers of its own being. One self, one being. He continues, this it does here by a successive evolution. It evolves successive forms and successive strata of consciousness, for it is not bound always to assume one form and no other, or to possess one kind of mentality which is its sole possible subjective manifestation. The soul is not bound by the formula of mental humanity. It did not begin with that and will not end with it. It had a pre-human past. It has a superhuman future. So many, many, many are the forms and the names in which we have taken birth, endlessly exploring all the possibilities available and a nature which is constantly developing its consciousness, often through the mysteries of our existence. We arrive at a moment where all becomes clear. The evolving soul achieves that miraculous self-revelation at some point in its evolution, and it knows its soul, and it knows what its nature is here to do. And then progressively it works out a still greater destiny than all the lines which karma would have delivered us to arrive at that point. A new turn begins. We move from the pre-human into the human and towards the superhuman. What we see of nature and of human nature justifies this view of a birth of the individual soul from form to form until it reaches the human level of manifested consciousness, which is its instrument for rising to yet higher levels. So, a transitional vehicle, not the end of the journey itself, just an engine that we use on the journey. We see that nature develops from stage to stage, and in each stage takes up its past and transforms it into stuff of its new development. We see, too, that human nature is of the same make. All the earth past is there in it. It has an element of matter taken up by life, an element of life taken up by mind, an element of mind which is being taken up by spirit. The animal is still present in its humanity. The very nature of the human being presupposes a material and a vital stage which prepared his emergence into mind, and an animal past which molded a first element of his complex humanity. So all this is here in us. And let us not say that this is because material nature developed by evolution, his life and his body and his animal mind, and only afterwards did a soul descend into the form so created. There is a certain truth behind this idea, but not the truth which that formula would suggest. This is that idea of the descent of the soul, the fall of the soul from some lofty heaven to be imprisoned in this woeful body, in this terrible universe, and we have to emerge from this field of suffering and gain access back to that from which we came. There is a descent. It isn't that, and it is not an unhappy descent. It is an intentional, a conscious descent that we have chosen to make, not something imposed upon us, but which we have selected. He continues, for that, supposes a gulf between soul and body, between soul and life, between soul and mind, which does not exist. There is no body without soul, no body that is not itself a form of soul. Matter itself is substance and power of spirit, and could not exist if it were anything else, for nothing can exist which is not substance and power of Brahman. And if matter, then still more clearly and certainly life and mind must be that, and ensouled by the presence of the Spirit. If matter and life had not already been ensouled, man could not have appeared, or only as an intervention or an accident, not as a part of the evolutionary order. Here he's suggesting the immanence of Sat-Chit Ananda here. Matter itself is substance, Sat, and power, Chit, tapas, of spirit. Matter, as we have seen in Sri Aurobindo's cosmology, is the inversion of the supreme spiritual substance itself. It is reality itself, hiding itself in what is apparently dark, taking its absolute unity and becoming fractured in the divisibility of the inconscience at the root of the chaotic cosmos. But always secretly, the unifying conscious power is there to reconstruct on the basis of that being what it really is, and reestablish the order intended. So an ensoulment has occurred, and this ensoulment, this vesting of Chit Shakti, the conscious spirit power, in nature, its actual presence here, that it imbues all of the cosmos, is also not just a Vedantic idea, but something familiar to the West in Neoplatonism, in the Hermetic philosophies of the Renaissance, and obviously is akin to the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And I might again note that the mother began her exploration of the mysteries of the cosmos with a Kabbalistic teacher, Max Thion. So we continue. We arrive then necessarily at this conclusion that human birth is a term at which the soul must arrive in a long succession of rebirths, and that it has had for its previous and preparatory terms in the succession the lower forms of life upon earth. It has passed through the whole chain that life has strung in the physical universe on the basis of the body, the physical principle. This is something wonderful to see in embryonic form. If you look at the tiny little human conceived in the womb and follow its growth, it seems to simulate, to express many, many different aspects of what has been its physical evolutionary chain throughout its whole history, culminating in that very human birth, or will culminate in that human birth. Then the farther question arises whether humanity once attained, this succession of rebirths still continues, and if so, how? By what series or by what alternations? So, he's established then that human birth is a necessary achievement in the chain of rebirths. The individual soul asserts itself through many, many forms and names, rising, achieving finally human status. Rebirth is necessary as a machinery in nature for building consciousness. and for extending it into evolution that arrives at new forms. And first, we have to ask whether the soul, having once arrived at humanity, can go back to the animal life and body, a retrogression which the old popular theories of transmigration have supposed to be an ordinary movement. So this is the typical idea. This is a part of, Pythagorean thought in ancient Greece. It's part of the ideas that we popularly associate with Punarjanman, the idea of rebirth in India. But Sri Aurobindo is not going to permit us to rest long in this idea that transmigration, just bumping around willy-nilly through the evolutionary chain, it was not appropriate for the progressive manifestation of a growing spirit. And he continues, it seems impossible that it should so go back with any entirety, and for this reason, that the transit from animal to human life means a decisive conversion of consciousness, quite as decisive as the conversion of the vital consciousness of the plant into the mental consciousness of the animal. Well, what's a conversion? It's from a Latin term which means to turn. So it's meaningful when you take a turn on a path, yes? So it's a turn from one condition to another. Here it's a deepening and a brightening of the consciousness. It is surely impossible that a conversion so decisive made by nature should be reversed by the soul, and the decision of the spirit within her come, as it were, to naught. In other words, here is this evolving spirit which has gone through all forms of life, from plant to animal, from animal finally to actuate itself as a human. And then, having spent all of its time building that, it's going to reverse course and go backwards instead? That doesn't make sense. It could only be possible for human souls, supposing such to exist, in whom the conversion was not decisive, souls that had developed far enough to make, occupy, or assume a human body, but not enough to ensure the safety of this assumption, not enough to remain secure in its achievement and faithful to the human type of consciousness. In other words, it might be possible for the human spirit to, let's say, for the spirit, the individual spirit, to evolve to the point where its aspiration is all focused on being a human. As we grow, and we come closer and closer to the human stage, we watch in wonderment at all these things that the human can do. We want to be like that. We want to grow. We want to try our hand at, or our paw at it. And so we give it a shot, and we leap and we land in that physical tenement of the human body. But we find we can't keep our grip. We're not really able yet to fully master it. Or we can only occupy the lower ranges of humanity. But let's say we can't really master it, and we have to slip back. Or something calls some aspect of us back to a forgotten or ignored experience, which is necessary to really integralize the achievement and stabilize it in the human condition. So we go back. Okay, so we have to repeat the first grade, but we're going to get back to the second grade, and then we're going to grow to the third grade. So it's not a defeat of the spirit, and it's not something that is customary, but it can happen. We can't say that in the long chain of natural evolution that it's impossible that this would occur, but it isn't usual. So let's continue. I guess we ought to mention that Mother on more than one occasion made comments about certain people in their evolutionary attainment who were there, permitted to be part of the ashram life and to live and to grow with that, because she accepted all kinds. She wanted somebody there that really felt the call to be in the ashram, that felt the aspiration because of the divine life that the ashram meant to achieve. But she wasn't trying to select the best of the best. You understand what I mean? So there was a young person who was part of the ashram school, the International Center of Education. And you may have read this in Mother's collected works. So I'll tell the story shortly, briefly. Who was not behaving in a way that was acceptable or within the norms of human growth. And teachers were complaining to Mother about it, and she listened and finally had to say with some poignance, but you see, it is his first human birth. And like that, you can immediately become more compassionate. When you see what's at stake for that being and what it's trying to achieve, what its mission is. So let's take it as a lesson to always peer beyond the surface and see what the evolutionary purpose is in this being, what it's trying to do. And let's partner that as best we can. All right. He continues, or at most, there might be, supposing certain animal propensities to be vehement enough to demand a separate satisfaction quite of their own kind, a sort of partial rebirth, a loose holding of an animal form by a human soul, with an immediate subsequent reversion to its normal progression. So it may go back for a brief visit to an older way of being, my good old used to be, as the folk song said, and then come back to assume the higher status. The movement of nature is always sufficiently complex for us not to deny dogmatically such a possibility, and if it be a fact, then there may exist this modicum of truth behind the exaggerated popular belief, which assumes an animal rebirth of the soul once lodged in man to be quite as normal and possible as a human reincarnation. But whether the animal reversion is possible or not, the normal law must be the recurrence of birth in new human forms for a soul that has once become capable of humanity. So this is our normal process. Onwards and upwards. But why a succession of human births and not one alone? So, it may be the right order of things for us to go through the whole evolutionary chain to achieve the human birth, but why isn't one human birth enough? Why can't we get it all done right now? For the same reason that has made the human birth itself a culminating point of the past succession, the previous upward series. It must be so by the very necessity of the spiritual evolution. For the soul has not finished what it has to do by merely developing into humanity. It has still to develop that humanity into its higher possibilities. Obviously, the soul that lodges in a Caribbee or an untaught primitive or an Apache of Paris or an American gangster has not yet exhausted the necessity of human birth, has not developed all its possibilities or the whole meaning of humanity, has not worked out all the sense of Satchit Ananda in the universal man. Neither has the soul lodged in a vitalistic European, occupied with dynamic production and vital pleasure, or in an Asiatic peasant engrossed in the ignorant round of the domestic and economic life. we may reasonably doubt whether even a Plato or a Shankara marks the crown and therefore the end of the outflowering of the spirit in man. We are apt to suppose that these may be the limit because these and others like them seem to us the highest point which the mind and soul of man can reach. But that may be the illusion of our present possibility. There may be a higher, or at least a larger possibility, which the divine intends yet to realize in man. And if so, it is the steps built by these highest souls which were needed to compose the way up to it and to open the gates. At any rate, this present highest point, at least, must be reached before we can write finis on the recurrence of the human birth for the individual. Man is there to move from the ignorance and from the little life which he is in his mind and body to the knowledge and the large divine life which he can compass by the unfolding of the Spirit. At least the opening out of the Spirit in him, the knowledge of his real self, and the leading of the spiritual life must be attained before he can go definitively and forever otherwhere. There may, too, be beyond this initial culmination a greater flowering of the Spirit in the human life, of which we have as yet only the first intimations. The imperfection of man is not the last word of nature, but his perfection, too, is not the last peak of the Spirit. So all these stations of humanity, from the lowest to the highest, we have to traverse, and we have to go beyond those two. The gate is ajar. The future beckons to us. I think you can say clearly that this transition to a greater life finds exemplars in the mother in Sri Aurobindo. And he writes these sentences modestly, but he certainly shows the means and the method by which we can grow beyond the normal realm of the human, beyond even the attainments of a Shankara or a Plato. And he knew both well. He read Plato in the original Greek, as might the ancient Greek, and he read Shankara in the original Sanskrit, as might the ancient Vedantin. This possibility becomes a certitude if the present leading principle of the mind as man has developed it, the intellect, is not its highest principle. If mind itself has other powers as yet only imperfectly possessed by the highest types of the human individual, then a prolongation of the line of evolution and consequently of the ascending line of rebirth to embody them is inevitable. So he's talking about higher ranges of mind. Continues, if supermind also is a power of consciousness concealed here in the evolution, the line of rebirth cannot stop even there. It cannot cease in its ascent before the mental has been replaced by the supramental nature and an embodied supramental being becomes the leader of terrestrial existence. So he gives the hint here that humanity may rise to an intuitive type, that the intuitive human may become overmental in its reach and characteristic. And then beyond that, that we ascend into the supramental. But as a consequence of having attained and normalized these other states of conscious growth, they have to become normal to us. And then comes the ascent. And then embodying the supramental, bringing it into the body, allows it to lead consciously and purposefully the terrestrial existence and evolution as it continues. So from our present mentality to the intuitive, from the intuitive to the overmental, these things attained by Sri Aurobindo, and then beyond to the supramental, those things aimed at and aspired for by Sri Aurobindo. This, then, is the rational and philosophical foundation for a belief in rebirth. It is an inevitable logical conclusion if there exists at the same time an evolutionary principle in the earth nature and a reality of the individual soul born into evolutionary nature. He asserts that there is. If there is no soul, then there can be a mechanical evolution without necessity or significance, and birth is only part of this curious but senseless machinery, the materialist view. If the individual is only a temporary formation beginning and ending with the body, then evolution can be a play of the all-soul or cosmic existence mounting through a progression of higher and higher species towards its own utmost possibility in this becoming, or to its highest conscious principle. Rebirth does not exist and is not needed as a mechanism of that evolution. This is if we are speaking about the cosmos only as being in development, and the individual does not exist really, only evanescently within that cosmic development. Or if the all-existence expresses itself in a persistent but illusory individuality, rebirth becomes a possibility or an illusory fact, but it has no evolutionary necessity and is not a spiritual necessity. It is only a means of accentuating and prolonging the illusion up to its utmost time limit. This would be the position of Advaita Vedanta, that there is no individual self. As long as it is engrossed in its illusion, it seems to exist to itself for whatever time limit is given to it by its illusory status, but never in reality is it an individual. He continues, if there is an individual soul or purusha, not dependent on the body, but inhabiting and using it for its purpose, then rebirth begins to be possible. But it is not a necessity if there is no evolution of the soul in nature. So here, whether or not evolution counts or not, is there a person? If there is an individual soul, is there an evolving soul? The presence of the individual soul in an individual body may be a passing phenomenon, a single experience without a past here or a future. Its past and its future may be elsewhere. And now we come to the crux. But if there is an evolution of consciousness in an evolutionary body, and a soul inhabiting the body, a real and conscious individual, then it is evident that it is the progressive experience of that soul in nature which takes the form of this evolution of consciousness. Rebirth is self-evidently a necessary part, the sole possible machinery of such an evolution. It is as necessary as birth itself, for without it, birth would be an initial step without a sequel, the starting of a journey without its farther steps and arrival. It is rebirth that gives to the birth of an incomplete being in a body its promise of completeness and its spiritual significance. So an evolving consciousness and body demand rebirth as a machinery, as a process to continue its upward series and its arrival at its destination. Its destiny is to arrive at its destination, which is a full recovery of its conscious being and the constituting delight which initiated its movement here, its immigration here, in the larger sense of the term. So, there we are. The end of chapter 20. Next week we take chapter 21 and continue really to look at the structure and the nature of and the meaning of rebirth. Where are we going? What are we doing? Let us find out. We come to Savitri tonight, to the Book of Beginnings, to continue the very passage that we started last week. I'd like to begin with the sentence that we ended with, and we'll read a little bit beyond the natural pause in the text. This is the Book of Beginnings, Book 1, Canto 5, The Yoga of the Spirit's Freedom and Greatness. The imprisoned deity rent its magic fence. As with a sound of thunder and of seas, vast barriers crashed around the huge escape. Immutably coeval with the world, circle and end of every hope and toil, inexorably drawn round thought and act, the fixed, immovable peripheries effaced themselves beneath the incarnate's tread. The dire velamen and the bottomless crypt, between which life and thought forever move, forbidden still to cross the dim dread bounds, the guardian darknesses mute and formidable, empowered to circumscribe the wingless spirit in the boundaries of mind and ignorance, protecting no more a dual eternity, vanished, rescinding their enormous role. Once figure of creation's vain ellipse, the expanding zero lost its giant curve. The old adamantine vetoes stood no more. Overpowered were earth and nature's obsolete rule. The python coils of the restricting law could not restrain the swift arisen God. Abolished were the scripts of destiny. There was no small, death-hunted creature more, no fragile form of being to preserve from an all-swallowing immensity. The great hammer beats of a pent-up world heart burst open the narrow dams that keep us safe against the forces of the universe. The soul and cosmos faced as equal powers. A boundless being in a measureless time invaded nature with the infinite. He saw unpathed, unwalled, his titan scope. All was uncovered to his sealless eye. A secret nature stripped of her defense, once in a dreaded half-light formidable, overtaken in her mighty privacy, lay bare to the burning splendor of his will. In shadowy chambers lit by a strange sun, and opening hardly to hidden mystic keys, her perilous arcanes and hooded powers confessed the advent of a mastering mind, and bore the compulsion of a time-born gaze. Incalculable in their wizard modes, immediate and invincible in the act, her secret strength native to greater worlds, lifted above our needy limited scope, the occult privilege of demigods, and the sure power pattern of her cryptic signs, her diagrams of geometric force, her potencies of marvel-fraught design, courted employment by an earth-nursed might. A conscious nature's quick machinery, armed with a latent splendor of miracle, the prophet passion of a seeing mind, and the lightning bareness of a free soul force. All once impossible deemed could now become a natural limb of possibility, a new domain of normalcy supreme. May such a domain become yours, and soon. Namaste. Jai Ma.